When I was pulled from the Pacific Ocean after 522 days adrift, the rescue crew found me talking to someone named Marcus, but there was no one else on my boat. I had survived the longest solo ordeal in maritime history, but the man they rescued wasn't the same Richard Brown who had sailed away in grief and desperation nearly 2 years earlier. What happens to the human mind when it's pushed beyond every conceivable limit of endurance and isolation? The morning sun cast long shadows across the marina as Richard Brown made his final preparations aboard the Wanderer, a 34-foot sailboat that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. At 52, Richard carried the weight of a man who had lost everything that mattered. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked the rigging one last time. But his eyes, those hollow, distant eyes, betrayed the emptiness that had consumed him since the accident. 6 months earlier, Richard's world had crumbled in an instant. The phone call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. Sarah, his wife of 28 years, and their daughter Emma, just 24 and fresh out of graduate school, had been driving home from Emma's birthday dinner when a drunk driver ran a red light. Both died on impact. The drunk driver walked away with minor injuries and a suspended license. Richard, a former maritime engineer who had spent decades designing offshore platforms, found himself adrift in a sea of grief that no amount of therapy, medication, or well-meaning friends could navigate. The house became a mausoleum of memories. Sarah's coffee cup still sat on the kitchen counter. Emma's graduation photos smiled down from the mantel. The silence was deafening. So he decided to disappear. The Wanderer wasn't just a boat, it was his escape route from a world that no longer made sense. Richard had purchased her 3 years earlier, planning weekend getaways with Sarah once he retired. Now, she would carry him away from everything he couldn't bear to face. His plan was simple: sail west into the Pacific as far as his supplies would take him, and let the ocean decide his fate. On September 15, 2022, Richard Brown cast off the lines for what he believed would be his final voyage. For the first week, the sailing was everything Richard had hoped it would be. The California coast fell away behind him, and with it, the crushing weight of his grief seemed to lift, if only slightly. The rhythmic sound of waves against the hull provided a hypnotic soundtrack to his solitude. He ate sparingly from his supplies: canned goods, dried fruits, fresh water stored in multiple containers. He wasn't planning to return, but some survival instinct kept him rationing anyway. Richard had charted a course roughly southwest, toward the vast emptiness between California and Hawaii. He avoided shipping lanes deliberately, seeking the kind of isolation that would make rescue impossible even if he changed his mind. His radio remained switched off. His GPS showed coordinates that meant nothing to anyone who might look for him, not that anyone would. He had told no one of his plans. On September 23rd, 8 days into his journey, the first storm hit. Richard had weathered storms before, but never alone, and never with such reckless indifference to his own survival. The swells grew to 15 feet, then 20. The Wanderer pitched and rolled like a toy in a bathtub. Richard, who should have been securing everything below deck, instead found himself standing at the bow, arms spread wide, screaming Sarah's name into the howling wind. That's when the boom swung across unexpectedly, catching him in the ribs and sending him tumbling across the deck. The impact cracked 2 ribs and opened a gash on his forehead that would never properly heal. More critically, it knocked him unconscious for what he later estimated to be several hours. When Richard came to, everything had changed. The storm had passed, but the Wanderer's mast was snapped halfway up, her sail torn to ribbons and dragging in the water like a wounded wing. The boom that had nearly killed him now hung at an impossible angle, held only by tangled rigging. Worse, the impact had damaged the rudder assembly, leaving the boat nearly impossible to steer. But the most devastating discovery came when Richard checked his navigation equipment. The GPS unit had been smashed during the storm, its screen dark and lifeless. His compass had been knocked from its mount and lay in pieces on the cabin floor. His backup navigation tools, charts, sextant, chronometer had all been stored in a locker that had burst open during the storm, sending everything into the churning bilge water. Richard Brown, master mariner with 30 years of experience, was now completely lost in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The first month was a study in methodical deterioration. Richard managed to jury-rig a partial sail using the torn canvas and some rope, giving him limited ability to move with the wind. But without proper navigation, he had no idea which direction would take him toward land. The prevailing winds seemed to push him further west, deeper into the Pacific's vast emptiness. His water supplies, originally intended to last 2 weeks, began running dangerously low. Richard had never been particularly religious, but he found himself praying for rain with an intensity that surprised him. When the first squall finally arrived in early October, he spread every available container on deck and managed to collect nearly 10 gallons of fresh water. It tasted like salvation. Food became an obsession. Richard had brought enough canned goods for a month, assuming he would either find land or surrender to the sea by then. Now, with no end in sight, he began rationing with mathematical precision. 1 can of beans could last 3 days if he ate only enough to keep the worst hunger at bay. A sleeve of crackers became a week's worth of meals. The physical changes came gradually, then all at once. His clothes began hanging loose on his frame. His face, once full and gentle, grew gaunt and angular. His hair, already gray, began falling out in clumps from malnutrition. But it was the mental changes that frightened him most. Richard began talking to Sarah. At first, it was just mumbled conversations during the long, empty hours. He would tell her about the dolphins he'd seen that morning, or describe the sunset in the same lyrical terms he'd once used during their evening walks. But as the isolation deepened, these one-sided conversations became elaborate dialogues. He would ask Sarah questions and wait for her responses, nodding thoughtfully at answers only he could hear. "Do you think I should try to sail north today?" he would ask the empty deck. Then, after a pause, "You're right, the wind isn't favorable. Maybe tomorrow." By November, Sarah was giving him detailed sailing advice. 67 days into his ordeal, Richard's grip on reality began to slip in earnest. Chronic dehydration, malnutrition, and complete isolation had created the perfect conditions for his mind to fracture. The hallucinations started small tricks of light on the water that looked like distant ships, or voices in the wind that sounded like rescue helicopters. But they quickly grew more elaborate and more real. Richard began seeing other boats around him, sometimes entire flotillas of vessels just beyond the horizon. He would wave frantically and shout until his voice was raw, but the boats never seemed to get closer. Sometimes he would see Sarah standing on the bow of a gleaming white yacht, beckoning him to follow. He would adjust his jury-rigged sail and chase the apparition for hours, only to find himself alone again when the sun set. The worst hallucination came on Thanksgiving Day, though Richard had long since lost track of holidays. He saw Emma sitting in the cockpit across from him, exactly as she had looked the last time he'd seen her alive. She was wearing the blue dress she'd worn to her birthday dinner, the last meal they'd ever shared. "Dad, you need to eat something," Emma said, her voice as clear as if she were really there. "You're getting too thin." Richard, who hadn't eaten in 2 days, obediently opened his last can of peaches and ate them slowly, savoring every drop of syrup, while Emma watched with concern in her eyes. "Are you angry with me?" Richard asked her, "for not being there that night?" Emma's expression was infinitely patient. "Dad, you couldn't have known. It wasn't your fault. I should have insisted on driving you home myself. I should have—" "Dad." Emma's voice was firm but gentle. "You need to stop punishing yourself. That's not what Mom and I would want." Richard began crying then, great heaving sobs that shook his emaciated frame. When he looked up again, Emma was gone, but the empty peach can sat before him as proof that something had happened, even if he could no longer trust his senses to tell him what. As his 4th month at sea began, Richard's relationship with the ocean itself began to change. What had once seemed like a vast, indifferent force now felt almost personal in its cruelty. The Pacific seemed to delight in offering hope, only to snatch it away at the last moment. Schools of fish would appear around the boat, but Richard's improvised fishing attempts yielded nothing. His hooks were too large, his technique too clumsy, his hands too weak to properly set a line. He watched thousands of potential meals swim tantalizingly, just out of reach. Birds became both salvation and torment. Occasionally, an exhausted seabird would land on the wanderer's rigging to rest. Richard, moving with the desperate stealth of a predator, managed to catch 3 birds over the course of 2 months. The first he ate raw, too starved to wait for a fire he couldn't build anyway. The taste was revolting, but the protein kept him alive for another week. Rain came in brief, violent squalls that soaked everything on deck but never lasted long enough to fully replenish his water supplies. Richard learned to sleep with his mouth open during these storms, trying to catch every precious drop. His tongue would swell with thirst between rainfalls, and he began drinking his own urine first reluctantly, then as a matter of routine. The most heartbreaking near rescue came in February, his 5th month adrift. Richard spotted what was unmistakably a commercial fishing vessel on the horizon, close enough that he could make out figures moving on her deck. He fired his last 2 flares, emergency signals he'd been saving for exactly this moment, and watched them arc into the clear sky like desperate prayers. The fishing boat changed course. For 20 agonizing minutes, Richard allowed himself to believe his ordeal was over. He could see the vessel getting larger, her engines carving a white wake through the blue water. As she approached, Richard waved his arms and shouted until his voice cracked, tears streaming down his sun-blistered cheeks. Then the boat stopped. Richard watched in growing horror as the fishing vessel held position for several minutes, then slowly turned away. Perhaps they had been investigating the flares but decided they were too far from the source. Perhaps they had other priorities. Perhaps they simply hadn't seen the small, damaged sailboat with its makeshift sail and its skeletal captain. Richard watched the fishing boat disappear over the horizon, taking with it his last real hope of rescue. That night, he tried to hang himself with a piece of rope from the rigging, but he was too weak to tie the knot properly, and when the rope slipped, he lacked the energy to try again. Even suicide, it seemed, was beyond his capabilities now. Winter in the Pacific brought a different kind of suffering. The storms were larger and more frequent, turning Richard's world into a constant battle against wind and waves. His jury-rigged sail, already patched and repatched dozens of times, finally gave out completely during a gale in March. Now the Wanderer was purely at the mercy of current and tide, a piece of driftwood carrying its dying passenger wherever the ocean chose to take him. Richard's body had become a catalog of everything that could go wrong with prolonged exposure and malnutrition. His gums had receded so far that several teeth fell out on their own. His skin, burned and reburned by the relentless sun, had developed lesions that refused to heal. His ribs were clearly visible beneath flesh that seemed to have forgotten how to retain moisture. Most disturbing were the changes to his mind. Richard found that he could no longer remember his life before the ocean. Sarah's face had become a blur of features that he couldn't quite assemble into a coherent image. Emma's voice in his hallucinations began sounding more and more like his own. The house they had shared, the job he had worked, the friends he had known, all of it seemed like scenes from a movie he had watched long ago. Sometimes, Richard would discover that days had passed without his awareness. He would find himself in a different part of the boat with no memory of how he'd gotten there. Once, he came to consciousness to find that he had apparently attempted to write a letter to Sarah on a piece of torn sail, but the words were illegible scratches that looked more like the work of an animal than a human being. The ocean had begun to feel like home. The constant motion that had initially made him seasick now seemed like the natural state of existence. When the rare calm days came, the stillness felt wrong and unnatural. Richard began to understand why some shipwreck survivors, when finally rescued, begged not to be taken from the water. By his 10th month adrift, Richard was no longer alone on the Wanderer. Marcus had joined him. Marcus was a young sailor, maybe 25, with sandy hair and an easy smile. He claimed to be from a Coast Guard cutter that had sunk in a storm, though he was vague about the details. Marcus was an excellent conversationalist and seemed to know a great deal about navigation and seamanship. He often had helpful suggestions about fishing or water collection. Richard knew, on some level, that Marcus wasn't real. But after months of complete isolation, even a hallucination was preferable to the crushing loneliness. Marcus never judged Richard for his appearance or his increasingly erratic behavior. He listened patiently to Richard's rambling stories about his life before the ocean, and he never mentioned the obvious fact that Richard was slowly dying. "You know," Marcus said one evening as they watched the sunset together, "I think we might be getting close to shipping lanes. I've been seeing more debris lately." Richard nodded eagerly. He trusted Marcus's judgment implicitly, even though part of him knew he was having a conversation with himself. How much longer do you think? Richard asked. Marcus considered this seriously. Hard to say, but I've got a good feeling about it. I think our luck is about to change. Richard held on to that hope like a lifeline, even as his body continued its steady deterioration. Marcus's presence made the endless days bearable in a way that even Sarah and Emma's appearances couldn't. Unlike his dead family, Marcus existed in the present, sharing Richard's current reality, rather than pulling him back into painful memories. But Marcus had a disturbing habit of disappearing just when Richard needed him most. During the worst storms, when Richard was certain the Wanderer would finally break apart and send him to the bottom, Marcus would vanish completely, leaving Richard to face his terror alone. It was only during the calm periods, when death seemed like a distant possibility rather than an immediate threat, that Marcus would reappear with his easy smile and optimistic predictions. Month 14 brought Richard to the absolute limits of human endurance. His weight had dropped from 180 pounds to barely 90. His hair had fallen out almost completely, and his skin had taken on a translucent quality that made him look more like a ghost than a man. His hands shook constantly, and he had lost the ability to grip objects firmly. The hallucinations had become constant and increasingly bizarre. Richard held long conversations with his deceased mother, argued politics with his high school history teacher, and received detailed weather reports from a TV meteorologist who appeared at the bow each morning. Sometimes he would wake to find himself in the middle of what appeared to be a dinner party, with dozens of people from his past crowding onto the Wanderer's small deck. But the most disturbing development was his growing inability to distinguish between sleep and waking. Richard would find himself in elaborate scenarios, walking through his old neighborhood, working in his office, shopping for groceries with Sarah, only to wake up and realize he was still on the boat. But then he would wake up again and again, until he could no longer tell which reality was true. During one particularly vivid episode, Richard found himself standing in Emma's childhood bedroom, watching her pack for college. She was 18 again, bright-eyed and excited about her future. "I'm going to study marine biology, Dad," she said, carefully folding a sweater into her suitcase. "I want to understand the ocean, the way you understand engineering." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Richard replied and meant it. "You'll make an excellent scientist." Emma turned to face him, and Richard was struck by how young she looked, how full of life and possibility. "Dad, will you come visit me at school?" "Of course I will. Every weekend if you'll let me." Emma smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. "Dad, you know that's not possible anymore, right?" Richard felt a chill run through him. "What do you mean?" "You're not really here, Dad. And I'm not really here either. We're both somewhere else now." The bedroom began to dissolve around them, the walls becoming transparent and then disappearing entirely. Richard reached out for Emma, but his hands passed through her like she was made of mist. "Wait," he called out. "Don't leave me." But Emma was already fading, her voice echoing from somewhere far away. "You have to let go, Dad. You have to stop holding on to us." Richard woke, if it could be called waking, to find himself sprawled on the Wanderer's deck, his cheeks wet with tears. Marcus was sitting beside him, looking concerned. "Bad dream?" Marcus asked gently. Richard nodded, unable to speak. "They're getting worse, aren't they? The dreams where you're somewhere else?" "I can't tell anymore," Richard whispered. "I can't tell what's real." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe real isn't as important as we think it is." As Richard entered his second year adrift, the boundaries between life and death became as blurred as those between dream and reality. There were days when he was certain he had already died and was experiencing some form of oceanic afterlife. Other days, he felt more alive than he ever had on land, as if the process of dying had somehow purified him. His physical condition had stabilized at a level just above death. His body had apparently found some equilibrium between starvation and survival, though he resembled a concentration camp survivor more than a living human being. He had learned to catch rainwater with desperate efficiency, and occasionally he managed to grab small fish or seabirds with his hands. These meager calories kept his heart beating, though he often wondered why it bothered. The most remarkable change was in his relationship with time. Richard had lost all sense of chronology. Days and nights blended together into an endless present moment that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. He would sometimes remember being a child, playing on the beach with his parents, and these memories felt as immediate and real as the waves lapping against the wanderer's hull. Marcus had become his constant companion now, never disappearing even during storms. But Marcus was changing too, becoming more translucent and distant. Their conversations had taken on a dreamlike quality, full of non sequiturs and references to things that had never happened. "Do you remember the time we sailed to Hawaii together?" Marcus would ask. Richard would nod, even though he knew they had never been to Hawaii, had never sailed anywhere together, had never actually met. "That was a good trip," Richard would reply. "I'm glad we did that." It was during one of these surreal conversations that Marcus made his most important observation. "Richard," he said, his voice more serious than usual, "I think it's almost time." "Time for what?" "Time for you to decide." "Decide what?" Marcus gestured toward the endless horizon. "Whether you want to keep floating, or whether you want to swim toward shore." Richard looked around in confusion. There was no shore visible, no sign of land in any direction. "What shore?" "The one you can't see yet," Marcus replied. "But it's there. It's always been there. You just have to decide whether you're ready to swim toward it." On March 20, 2024, exactly 522 days after Richard Brown had cast off from the California marina, a Japanese research vessel named Kuroshio spotted something unusual on their radar. It appeared to be a small boat, drifting approximately 800 miles southwest of the Hawaiian Islands. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka altered course to investigate, more out of curiosity than any real expectation of finding survivors. In these remote waters, debris was common: pieces of ships lost in storms, containers that had fallen from cargo vessels, the occasional abandoned pleasure craft. What they found defied explanation. The Wanderer was barely recognizable as a boat. Her mast was long gone. Her deck was warped and cracked from sun exposure, and most of her rigging had either rotted away or been jury-rigged into incomprehensible configurations. But impossibly, someone was aboard. The figure on the deck was so emaciated and sun-damaged that the rescue crew initially thought they were looking at a corpse. The man's skin was burned nearly black, his hair was completely gone, and his clothes hung in tatters on a skeletal frame. But when they called out, the figure raised its head and looked at them with eyes that still held a spark of human intelligence. Getting Richard aboard the research vessel required extreme care. He weighed less than 90 pounds and was so dehydrated that his skin felt like paper. He kept asking for someone named Marcus, becoming agitated when the crew couldn't find this other person. "He was just here," Richard insisted weakly as they carried him to the ship's medical bay. "We were just talking. Marcus, where are you?" The Japanese crew searched the Wanderer thoroughly, but found no sign that anyone else had ever been aboard. The boat's log, what little remained of it, contained only Richard's handwriting, though much of it was illegible or consisted of conversations with people who weren't there. Dr. Yuki Sato, the research vessel's medical officer, had never seen anything like Richard's condition. Apart from the obvious malnutrition and dehydration, Richard appeared to be suffering from severe psychological trauma. He spoke frequently to people who weren't there, became confused about basic facts like the date and his location, and seemed genuinely surprised to learn that he had been at sea for over 17 months. "I was only supposed to be out for a few weeks," Richard told Dr. Sato during one of his more lucid moments. "Sarah will be worried sick." When Dr. Sato gently explained that Richard had been missing for nearly 2 years, Richard became silent for several hours. Later, he seemed to have no memory of the conversation. The news of Richard Brown's miraculous survival made headlines around the world. 522 days lost at sea was among the longest solo survival ordeals ever recorded. Maritime experts called it impossible. Psychologists struggled to explain how his mind had endured such prolonged isolation. The media dubbed him the ghost of the Pacific. But Richard himself seemed oddly disconnected from his newfound fame. During the 3 weeks it took Kuroshio to reach port in Honolulu, he spent most of his time staring out at the ocean, occasionally speaking to someone the crew couldn't see. He ate the food they gave him mechanically, as if nutrition was a foreign concept he was still trying to understand. The Coast Guard investigation that followed raised more questions than it answered. Richard's original plan to disappear had worked perfectly. No one had reported him missing because no one had known he was gone. His house had been foreclosed on after months of missed mortgage payments. His mail was being held at the post office. For all practical purposes, Richard Brown had successfully erased himself from existence. Medical tests revealed the full extent of what his body had endured. Chronic malnutrition had damaged his liver and kidneys. Sun exposure had given him multiple skin cancers. His bones had become brittle from calcium deficiency. His dental health was catastrophic. But most concerning were the neurological changes. Brain scans showed significant alterations in the areas responsible for memory formation and social interaction. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the psychiatrist assigned to Richard's case in Honolulu, had worked with trauma survivors for 20 years. But Richard presented unique challenges. His memories of the 522 days were fragmentary and often contradictory. He insisted on the reality of people who clearly hadn't been there, and he seemed unable to form new memories that lasted more than a few hours. It's as if his mind created an entirely separate reality to survive the isolation. Dr. Rodriguez explained to the Coast Guard investigators, the line between what actually happened and what his psyche invented for protection has been completely erased. Richard's most consistent memory was of Marcus, the young sailor who had kept him company during the worst periods. Richard became deeply distressed when medical staff suggested that Marcus might not have been real. "He saved my life," Richard insisted. "He kept me going when I wanted to give up. He's the reason I'm here talking to you right now." As Richard's physical condition slowly improved, the full tragedy of his situation became clear. The man who had returned from the Pacific was not the same man who had sailed away in grief and despair. The Richard Brown who had lost his wife and daughter in a car accident was gone, replaced by someone who existed in a fractured reality, where the boundaries between memory, hallucination, and present experience had dissolved. He could not return to his old life because he no longer remembered most of it. The house where he had lived with Sarah and Emma was just a concept to him now, no more real than the conversations he'd had with his dead family on the boat. When well-meaning relatives tried to visit, Richard looked at them with polite confusion, as if they were strangers claiming to know someone he'd never been. The cruelest irony was that Richard's original plan had succeeded too well. He had wanted to escape the pain of losing his family, and, in a sense, he had. But the ocean had taken not just his grief, it had taken his capacity to grieve, his ability to remember what he had lost, his connection to the life he had lived before. Dr. Rodriguez worked with Richard for 6 months, trying various therapies to help him reconnect with his past. But the man who sat in her office bore only a physical resemblance to the maritime engineer who had sailed into the Pacific nearly 2 years earlier. The Richard who had designed offshore platforms, who had loved his wife and daughter, who had been destroyed by their loss. That man had died somewhere in the vast emptiness of the ocean. What remained was something both more and less than human. A survivor who had transcended the normal limits of endurance, but at the cost of everything that had made him who he was. Richard Brown died on September 15, 2025, exactly 3 years after he had first cast off from the California marina, and just over 1 year after his rescue. The cause of death was listed as complications from long-term malnutrition and exposure. But those who knew him best understood that he had never really returned from the Pacific at all. In his final months, Richard had lived in a care facility in San Diego, spending his days staring out at the ocean with the same expression he'd worn aboard Kuroshio. He spoke less and less as time went on, though nurses occasionally heard him having quiet conversations with invisible companions. Sometimes he would ask about Marcus, wondering when his friend would come to visit. The few possessions recovered from the wanderer were donated to a maritime museum, where they became part of an exhibit on survival at sea. The boat itself was deemed unseaworthy and was broken up for scrap. But the museum's most haunting artifact was Richard's improvised journal pages torn from books and navigation charts, covered with handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as the months passed. The entries from his final weeks at sea were barely legible, consisting mostly of fragments and half-sentences. But the last readable entry, written in what appeared to be his own blood when ink ran out, consisted of just 4 words: "I want to come home." The tragedy of Richard Brown was not that he died at sea, it was that he survived it. The ocean had given him back his life, but kept his soul as payment. He returned to a world he could no longer recognize, carrying memories of conversations with the dead and friendships with phantoms. He had achieved the impossible feat of surviving 522 days alone in the Pacific, but the cost had been everything that made survival worthwhile. In the end, Richard Brown had gotten exactly what he thought he wanted when he sailed away that September morning. He had escaped his grief, his memories, and his unbearable life. But the ocean, in its infinite cruelty, had shown him that some things are worse than the pain we're trying to escape. The last person to speak with Richard before his death was Dr. Rodriguez, who visited him the day before he passed. She found him sitting by the window, looking out at the San Diego harbor, with the same distant expression he'd worn since his rescue. "Richard," she said gently, "how are you feeling today?" He turned to look at her, and for just a moment his eyes seemed to focus with something approaching clarity. "Do you know?" he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I think I finally remember what I was trying to forget." Those were the last coherent words Richard Brown ever spoke. He died in his sleep that night, and the nurses who found him said he looked more peaceful than he had since the day he'd been pulled from the Pacific. But they also noted something troubling. Richard had died with his arms wrapped around himself, as if embracing someone who wasn't there. And in his final moments, they heard him whisper a single word: "Marcus." The ghost of the Pacific had finally found his way home.